Welcome back to Sacred Conversations where faith and identity meet. Today, we're stepping into one of the oldest and most understood stories in all of Scripture, Sodom and Gomorrah. If you grew up in church, you probably heard that Sodom was destroyed because of homosexuality. That's what most of us were taught. God rained down fire because the people were sexually immoral. But what if that's not what the Bible actually says? What if the story used for centuries to condemn queer people was never about sex at all? So let's break this down into three categories. The first category, the story people think they know. The second, what the text actually says. And lastly, how that meaning changed over time and how reclaiming it can heal the harm. Just a reminder of something Paul wrote in a letter to Timothy. It's found in Second Timothy chapter 2 verse 15. It says, "Study to show thyself approved, rightly dividing the word of truth." And that's our posture today. So let's start with the version most of us grew up hearing. Genesis 19, right? So in Genesis 19, two angels visit the city of Sodom. They meet Lot, Abraham's nephew, who invites them to stay at his home for the night. So, as the story goes, the men of the city surround the house and demand that Lot hand over his guests so that they could know them. Lot refuses, and in a deeply disturbing moment, he offers his daughters instead. Moments later, the city is struck with blindness, and by morning, fire rains down from heaven, destroying Sodom and its sister city, Gomorrah. That's the story as it's usually told, and for generations, pastors and theologians pointed to the phrase to know them as proof that the men of Sodom were gay, that the city was destroyed because of homosexuality. It became so ingrained in our language that the very word sodomy was coined from this story, used in law codes, sermons, and even medical manuals to describe same sex acts. But that interpretation, the gay sin of Sodom narrative, didn't exist until centuries after the story was written. So, what was it really about? Well, notice that this version skips Genesis chapter 18, where Abraham argues with God about justice and mercy before the destruction. You see, Abraham bargains, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" This frames the question, is God just? It also leaves out context when it comes to why hospitality matters in the ancient Near East. It also shows later in biblical writers they describe Sodom's sin. And then the horror of a mob using sex as a weapon, not a picture of love. You see, we were handed a conclusion without being given the tools to read the text. Before we go further, I want to name the pain. This teaching didn't just live in books, it lives in bodies. The Sodom story has justified shame, rejection, violence against queer people for generations. So today we return to the text with reverence, care, and truth. Again, let's focus on Genesis 18, the chapter before, where God tells Abraham that a great outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah has reached heaven. Language the Hebrew Bible uses for injustice against the vulnerable. Abraham bargains, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" This frames the question, is God just? And then Genesis 19, it opens with two messengers or angels at Sodom's gate. Lot insists on hosting them by washing their feet, preparing a meal, classic ancient Near Eastern hospitality. You see, in that world, welcoming a traveler was not optional, it was a moral duty, especially at night when the roads were dangerous. The crowd demands, bring them out that we may know them. That Hebrew verb is yada. Yada appears over 900 times in the Hebrew Bible. It simply means to know, to recognize, to become acquainted, to make known, to investigate, or to even to interrogate. And sometimes it can even be a euphemism for sex, but context decides. Here in this scene, there's nothing about romance or courtship. It's about a hostile mob trying to shame and overpower outsiders. And in the ancient world, sexual violence or sexual violation could be used as a tool of domination, especially against strangers. So this is about assault, not orientation. All right. So Lot offered his daughters instead. There's no way to soften this. That's just abhorrent. The text is not approving it. It's showing how far a host might go tragically, even sinfully, to protect guests under a sacred hospitality code. The point isn't hetero is better. The point is the city's depravity and the failure of justice. In Judges 19, the atrocity at Gibeah, a mob demands a male guest, the host, instead and the host instead sends out a woman who gets abused and killed. The Bible repeats this pattern to condemn communal violence, failed hospitality, and the breakdown of covenant ethics. Again, the issue is brutality, not loving relationships. When later biblical writers reflect on Sodom, listen to the diagnosis. In Ezekiel 16 and 16, verses 49 through 50, it says, "This was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, meaning pride, overfed, and excess of food, unconcerned, but did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did abominable things. The focus is arrogance, neglect of the vulnerable, and social injustice. There it is, plain as day. There's no mention of sexuality, no mention of same sex behavior. Ezekiel says the sin was arrogance, greed, and neglect of the vulnerable. All right, let's go to Isaiah chapter 1, verse 10, verses 17, where it invokes Sodom, calling, sorry, just kind of scrolled up ahead of me here. Sorry about that. But it invokes Sodom by calling Judah to seek justice, a symbol of injustice and hypocrisy, de- defending the oppressed. You learn to do good, seek justice, defend the oppressed. You take up the cause of the fatherless. You plead the case of the widow. That's what Isaiah says. And then you hop on over to Jeremiah 23, verse 14, where it speaks of prophets in Jerusalem acting like Sodom, lying, strengthening evildoers. The prophets understood something we lost, that Sodom was a story about a society that had power but no compassion. Even Jesus referred to Sodom in Matthew chapter 10, verses 14 through 15, saying that cities which reject the message of hospitality and peace will fare worse, fare worse than Sodom on the day of judgment. All right, and then Jude chapter 7. It's often quoted against LGBTQ people. It mentions people going after strange flesh. In context with Jewish literature of the time, this points to attempted intercourse with angels, i.e., crossing of heavenly boundaries, not consenting human same sex love. So, from Genesis to Jesus, the Bible is consistently clear. Sodom's sin is violence, pride, refusal of hospitality, not same gender love. The men of Sodom weren't condemned for loving someone of the same sex, they were condemned for trying to dehumanize others. That's a major difference. Love was never the problem, violence was. If the Bible itself frames Sodom around injustice and the lack of hospitality, how did the church come to treat it as the ultimate gay story? You see, the shift began long after the text was written. So let's talk about early interpretations. Over in the first few centuries AD, Jewish and Christian interpreters began reading Genesis 19 through their own cultural lens, one shaped by patriarchy and purity. Writers like Philo of Alexandria and Josephus started linking Sodom to sexual immorality. In general, not because the text said so, but because sex was seen as the easiest symbol of moral decay. By the Middle Ages, church leaders like Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas used Sodom to systemize natural versus unnatural acts. Sodom or sodomy became a catch all legal and theological category for any non procreative sex, not a careful reading of Genesis 19, but a moral taxonomy. Thus, it lumped together every act that wasn't procreative sex between a man and a woman. Civil laws followed theology. Christian kingdoms penalized sodomy broadly. The story hardened into a weapon. Then, during colonial times, European empires, missionaries, governments, they all exported their language, Bibles, and their morality codes. Colonial penal laws criminalized queer people across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean in the name of God. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, with the rise of respectability and later fundamentalist literalism, Sodom became a political idea. During the AIDS crisis, some preachers misused Sodom to frame tragedy as divine punishment. A text about protecting the vulnerable was twisted to persecute them. I'll admit that when you first hear this, you feel a mix of anger and relief. Anger that so many people have been destroyed by a misunderstanding, relief that God's character once again proves more loving than religion has told us. History shows it wasn't the Bible that changed, it was our lens. Fear, patriarchy, legalism, and empire replaced hospitality, justice, and mercy. So, what does this mean for us? When we give Sodom back its biblical meaning, three things happen that help repair. We repair God's character, which isn't that the most important part, right? We repair his character from an angry deity who's obsessed with sex to a just God who hears the outcry of the oppressed. We repair scripture's integrity, reading with context and courage, not fear. And then lastly, we repair community, refusing to weaponize text against people made in God's image. If this story has been used to wound you, again, your pain is valid. The shame you were handed is not from God. It's not. The arc of scripture bends toward welcome, from Abraham's hospitality to the prophet's justice to even Jesus's table that kept getting bigger. So, one of the things I want you to do is ask yourself a question. Is my interpretation producing the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, etc. If not, it isn't the gospel. What would it look like to reverse Sodom in our time? We would need to open our homes and our hearts to the stranger. That means protecting those at risk from mob harm. You think about online trolling or even in person. We would build churches where safety is not a slogan, but a system. Hospitality isn't coffee at the door, it's covenant care. Sodom and Gomorrah is not a story about who you love, it's a warning against power without compassion and community without care. It calls us to a different fire, the refining fire of love that purifies fear. It restores dignity and lights the way home. Thank you so much for journeying with me. If today's study brought clarity or peace, share it with someone who needs healing. This is Sacred Conversations. I want to remind you that your story is sacred, your faith is valid, and you belong. Until next time, stay true, stay free, and stay in love.